All right, welcome back to another special edition of the Claremont Institute podcast, The Stakes. In that case, named after my September 2020 book, which you should all buy. My name is Michael Anton. I am a lecturer at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus, and I also do things with the Claremont Institute, including this podcast. This is at least the third and maybe the fourth, I lose track, podcast with Charles Haywood, who has become known to most, or if not all of you. And I think there's a lot to talk about today, but I think we will begin, since Charles has some dodgy Eastern European connections. He may be able to bring insight to us on what's going on in Ukraine, which I admit, despite having, uncharacteristically for me, putting in some real effort to track down accurate news and figure out what's going on, which I mostly don't do about things anymore because A, the news is depressing, B, I think they're all liars, and C, I have other things to do. I'm interested enough in this to try to figure out what's happening. And I have no idea, in part because of the middle reason. I think everyone's lying. I think the Ukrainians are lying, or I suspect, let me put it that way, that they're greatly exaggerating the casualty count and the success of the Ukrainian resistance, whether that's the professional military or the civilian insurgency, if you want to call it. I think, in addition, it seems that the Russians, who are mostly silent about this, but when they do talk, refuse to acknowledge any setbacks or casualties. And I find that also kind of hard to believe. And it goes without saying, although I will say it, that I don't really believe anything that comes out of the American government or its regime media, which is sad. I wish I could. And I wish I did. I wish they were credible. I'm sure I'll be called bad names for saying something like that. Unpatriotic. How could I possibly not believe my own government? Well, it has a track record of not telling the truth. That's why I can possibly not believe my own government. So I don't know what's going on. And hopefully Charles does, and he can tell us.
Well, I will say that regardless of what you say, you're certain to be called names. But
Yeah.
I agree with pretty much every aspect of that little intro, particularly the middle piece that everybody's lying. And I'll come back to that in a second. I will say, though, that the stakes, having been written September 2020, that really seems like a long time ago now. It's just completely bizarre to me. So as you say, I have a particular interest in this area of the world. I wouldn't say I have a particular expertise, but my father did teach Russian history for his entire career. So I picked up some Russian history by osmosis, and he was a 19th century specialist primarily rather than a 20th century specialist. So in some ways, that's actually more useful for today's events than discussion about the Soviet Union, which is, I think, in some ways less relevant to what might be called a greater Russia than the 19th century history, and even more relevantly, perhaps, I'm half Hungarian, and what is now part of Ukraine, Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which is the border between Hungary and Ukraine now, used to be part of Hungary. And of course, as everybody knows, or I don't know if anybody knows this, but much of what is Western Ukraine is actually Poland. And so you see this weird kind of thing. I've actually traveled in what's Western Ukraine though some years ago. What people think of as Ukraine, the unitary nation, is not, of course, really a unitary nation, or in some ways not even a nation at all, though I'm sure the Ukrainian nationalists would object to that characterization. But my opinion on it is, I really have no idea what's going on. I'm not going to give you a bunch of hot takes. My problem is that I've been telling my children since 2018 that history will return. And history has returned, but in the modern information age, for some reason, that seems to mean that we have less rather than more reliable information, which I don't think is something people would have predicted even 10 or 15 years ago. I'm not quite sure what it is, whether it's the Twitterization of everything or the regime media lying all the time. It's obvious that our regime, broadly speaking, both the American regime and the Western kind of left-wing liberal democratic regime, supports the Ukrainians. And I feel bad for the Ukrainians too, because obviously war is bad. But you get the suspicion that you're being lied to in a more systematic way than merely obviously the Ukrainians have an incentive to cast themselves as the good guys, and the casualties is high, civilian casualties. This is all standard stuff. You get the impression there's a much broader propaganda campaign. But seeing the parameters of that, or even figuring it out, it seems like a total waste of time, because the more you dig into it, the more it's like punching Jello. So I haven't honestly spent a lot of time reading or thinking or viewing things because I don't regard it as an overly profitable exercise.
Yeah, I'm pretty much there. I did spend maybe the last 3 days or so really trying to dig in and figure something out. I don't feel like I got very far. And so I'm kind of thinking, all right, what's the point, and why do I want to expend this amount of effort for something that doesn't seem to be yielding any returns? So let's just state, though, well, here are some things we know, and you touched on one of them, right? We know that the regime that rules us wants to insist that Ukraine is entirely innocent, that Russia is wholly to blame, and that to be a decent person in 2022, you have to hate Putin and Russia, and you have to want to be all in for Ukraine. And okay, they say that. Now, that may actually be the true take. But when I hear it, the problem is when I hear it from certain voices incessantly, blaringly, I immediately begin to distrust, right? So I have done some, what's easier to figure out than what's going on right now is some of the historical stuff. And I've done some reading on that, right? And it seems to me the situation is very complicated. It does go back decades and really centuries in ways that American policymakers don't understand, but have decided to kind of butt their way in on something that they don't understand, a complicated, volatile situation. And as far as I can tell, have made it worse. And now that they have made it worse, they want to excise any talk about any of their potential mistakes, whether those mistakes have occurred in the last 5 weeks or the last 5 years or the last 50. And basically just say, well, if you question us, if you dare question any American or Western policy in this part of the world, that means you are Putinite and in favor of invading sovereign countries unprovoked and civilian casualties. You are for all of those things. If you ask why the Americans or the Europeans or NATO did X or Y or Z in 1992 or 1989, right? Don't even ask, or you're a Putinite. And Putin is now, Hitler. I mean, he's Hitler Jr., according to this narrative. Now, I mean, look, there are commonalities, right? Hitler invaded countries. Putin has invaded a country. So I get that point. And I'm not even going to go where one could obviously go, right? If a very cynical anti-American analyst of foreign policy would say, and America doesn't invade countries? Really? You're going to play that card when you guys have been on a bit of an interventionist spree for the last 20 years? I'm not even going to accept that necessarily as an argument, because this is such a completely different set of circumstances. But the propaganda, I think, of you must be for X and against Y, or else you are a bad person. I mean, Hillary Clinton is all but saying we ought to keep tabs on and investigate people for taking these kinds of stands. It's going to get to the point. Others, Lawrence Tribe, the famous Harvard professor, used the word treason to describe people who question or disagree with the present policy on this, which I think is insane. You can't even disagree with the policy anymore. That's treason.
Much of this is a total failure of historical knowledge and imagination. And you touched on that. I mean, everybody in charge now seems to think that history began in 1968 with a bunch of hippies, and all history before that consisted of like the Crusades, which were bad, and World War II, which was bad because Hitler was in it. And that's pretty much all the history they know. And so you get a little bit of a version of this, as the metaphor goes. You see people watching two different movies on two different screens. From a Putin perspective, the declared geopolitical or strategic goals, namely not having Ukraine in NATO and not having that security risk, as well as the kind of cultural goals, are entirely unexceptional. And one thing I thought was very interesting, which I haven't seen anyone comment on, is for weeks we were told, of course, that Putin was going to invade, and it didn't seem like it was going to happen. So that seemed weird, but that's not my point. My point is that there was all this to do about how Putin was going to create these false flags to justify his invasion of Ukraine. And he didn't bother to do any of that. He just said, this is my strategic goal. And, today we are invading. I mean, so what my point is that shows a kind of failure of imagination on the part of Western policymakers to understand that other people think in this way, which used to be the standard way, that I have strategic goals, and today I'm going to start a war in order to achieve those goals. And this idea of like false flags and propaganda and so on is really a very modernist idea, a kind of way of
and often hard to pull off.
Public opinion skids.
often hard to pull off too. I think one of the things I taught my class last night of talking to the students,
That must have been interesting.
and they're they're reading all of this stuff too, and a bit prone, I would say, to accept theories that, I mean, I'm not saying my students are conspiracy theorists, but they do have a sense, maybe it's a naive, youthful sense that adults, and especially people in serious positions of power, don't simply screw things up. Therefore, when you see something that looks fishy, there must be an ulterior plan. Or I can quote, of course, my favorite philosopher writer, Niccolo Machiavelli, the Discourses on Livy, Book 3, Chapter 48. When you see an enemy make a manifest blunder, he says, there will always be fraud underneath. So anything that appears to be a mistake, if you're dealing with someone who knows what they're doing, is not a mistake. It's covering up a deception. And I get that. The students seem to kind of want to believe that. And I think it may partly be attributable to young people's eagerness to believe that the adults know what they're doing. But I had to sort of pour cold water on it and say, you know what? No, sometimes when things seem completely messed up, it's because they're just completely messed up and nobody knows what they're doing. And there is no 5D chess conspiracy underneath. It's just incompetence, bungling, unintended consequences, and so on.
I think that's totally right. And you have a sense that it could all go very badly simply because nobody's in charge and nobody has any clue, and people are playing with things that in the past smart men knew exactly where the lines were and what to do and what could be done and what the appropriate ways to act were in these situations in order to prevent things from getting out of control. I mean, Carl Schmitt, who is one of my favorite kind of modern political philosophers, I favor him more than Machiavelli. No offense, but he has
that's a mistake, but okay.
He has this line or thing in The Concept of the Political, which is one of his books, that you have to have a politics of realism in order to limit enmity, because otherwise you end up in a catastrophic conflict. And what we most definitely don't have is a politics of realism. What we have is the politics of clowns.
No, and we don't have a politics right now to limit enmity. I mean, it seems like the regime wants to dial up as much enmity for the Russian as possible, which, you know, they don't see a line between justifiably criticizing this invasion or the conduct of the Russian army and so on, and just all out, full-throated, constant demonization, which could lead to such bad blood between not just these two countries, the United States and Russia, but between two civilizational blocks that could end in some kind of disaster later. So I have a bunch of things I want to say, but I keep thinking of new ones. One small point, I mentioned this talking point to students the other day, and then if you turn on the TV, you hear it everywhere now. I guess it's a quip maybe attributed to John McCain or somebody, but they like to say, you know, well, Russia is it's not a country. It's a gas station with nuclear missiles, by which they mean Russia's primarily an extractive economy with based on oil and natural gas, doesn't have a whole lot else. So we can belittle it as a gas station with nuclear weapons. Okay, it's a great quip, I suppose. It's a wonderful tweet. It's something to throw out there when you're on cable news and you don't have a whole lot of airtime to say something. But I'm thinking, how does it help us to gratuitously, because, you know, there are about, how many Russians are there? Close to 200 million, right?
I think it's slightly more than 200 million.
Is it slightly more? It's even more. Okay. Well, you know, first of all, not all of them are responsible for what's going on here. We know that not all of them support what's going on here because there have been pretty significant street protests in major Russian cities, including St. Petersburg, that Putin either didn't anticipate or thought would be smaller. I don't know. And so how does it help to just insult the entire civilization? Remember, this isn't a matter of war propaganda to motivate the American people because we're not in the war. Mm-hmm. So how does it help to just insult this entire civilizational block and say, you're not even a country. You're nothing. You're a gas station, right? That just seems to, I mean, it's such a small point, but it illustrates the fact that, as you said, we're not trying to minimize the enmity here. We seem to want to increase it for its own sake. And I just think that could lead to very bad places.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, wisdom is in very short supply. And I don't know what exactly is driving it. I think underlying much of this is the same thing that divides America, which is regime hatred for people who maintain what might broadly be called traditional views of the world, as opposed to the kind of left Enlightenment view of the world of never-ending emancipation and never-ending egalitarianism. And really, as a nation state, Russia stands against that. more than any other country. You can argue whether that's just all a propaganda move by Putin and point out that the Russians have a low birth rate and all the other things that, Russia is not some kind of shining beacon of anti-Enlightenment civilization in practice. But for the same reason that Hungary and Poland are attacked because they won't subscribe fully to this regime project, there's a lot of just inherent enmity by our regime, our ruling classes for Russia. And I got to think a large part of the enmity results from that.
Okay, now we have to, at least I have to, before we go too far in this direction, say some negative things about Putin, just, to make sure that people are listening. Right, okay, but some background first. As I understand this country, right, Ukraine, it's a very complicated situation. So the country as currently constituted, when we think of a nation state, we think of a country with borders and everybody, or at least the vast majority of people in it, 80 or 90%, are all of a particular ethnic group, perhaps prescribing to a particular faith and speaking a particular language. Okay. France, as we know, is divided. It has immigrant populations that come in the post-war era and so on. It's long had some Catholic Protestant divisions and a significant Jewish community. But by and large, we would still say that France is 80% or so French, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Ukraine has never been, as I understand it, at least Ukraine with its current borders, 80% Ukrainian. It's about, I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but it's somewhere between half and half of people who look West, who may be Catholic or who at least are not Eastern Orthodox looking to Moscow, and who speak the Ukrainian language. And these are the people who mostly think of themselves as Ukrainian. Then you have significant population in the East, some of which has now been effectively reincorporated back into Russia as of 2014. But let's go back to the pre-2014 borders. People who are ethnically Russian, consider themselves Russian, speak Russian, are Orthodox, and look to an Orthodox patriarch in Moscow. And I understand that there's an ecclesiastical split that was, used or at least exacerbated for geopolitical purposes in the 2010s to set up a rival Orthodox patriarch to the Moscow patriarch. Okay, I'm no expert on this, but I've tried to read up on it.
Yeah, but that's generally correct as I understand it.
So the problem is you have what's basically, if not a half and half country, it's a 60-40 country or maybe a 40-40-20 country or something. And a big part of the country wants to be Russian, or at least wants friendly relations with Russia, close ties to Russia. And a big part of the country fears Russia for reasons that are obvious. Russian, both Tsarist Russian domination of Ukraine and Soviet Russian domination of Ukraine, and wants to be alone. Right now, here's the Putin critical part, or a question. Putin is, as I understand it, he is justifying his actions here on the long-standing, centuries-old historical ties between Ukraine and Russia. The introduction of Christianity into the Russian civilization begins in Kiev. Kiev is a historic city of the Russian Empire. In fact, for part of its history, was the capital of the Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. All of this, he says, we can't be apart. We're brothers. Well, but this sets up for him, doesn't it, a very significant, at a minimum, rhetorical or PR problem. That is to say, we're brothers and we belong together. And by God, I'm going to make it happen through an invasion and force of arms is not a winning message, is it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there's another element here, which I don't fully grasp. I mean, we don't fully grasp much, it seems to me. But Ukraine is kind of a basket case country. That is, it's ruled by a bunch of oligarchs who are basically beholden to the West. But more broadly, I think I read the statistic in the past 30 years, it's in the bottom 5 countries in the world in its rate of growth and development. Yeah, I mean, it's like barely above Somalia. So I think that, and the life expectancy is low and dropped like Russia, but stayed down lower than Russia. So I think my impression is that the life of the average Ukrainian is fairly miserable. And so maybe that plays into it too. We don't see this for the same reason that when American media outlets talk about Iran, they pick the 10 young English-speaking people in Tehran and use them as the supposed exemplars of the Iranian nation. I don't get the impression that we're getting the real Ukrainian opinion, leaving aside like Ukrainians who explicitly want to be close to Russia because they're on the border and they have, right. I mean, just the average person who feels himself Ukrainian, what does he think about Ukraine? My guess is that he has a very negative view of the government and the West and Russia.
I mean, people's opinions on that can be complicated. That is to say, it's possible to be patriotic and nationalistic and realize that your government is a basket case.
Sure.
but then not want, you don't want the solution to your government being a basket case to be foreign domination. But
are you describing me or are you describing Ukraine?
No, just in general. I think there are probably a lot of people in Ukraine who think I'm a Ukrainian patriot. I love Ukraine and I love the land and the people and the language and the culture. But yes, this government is horrible. But the solution to that should not be, being invaded and dominated by a foreign power.
No, I agree.
Your point on, though, the quality of life in Ukraine, I read somewhere, in more than one place actually, that somewhere between 30% and a third of living Ukrainian nationals live abroad. Mm-hmm. They've left precisely because the GDP per capita is about $3,000. I mean, that's really low. I mean, you think about countries that we think of as poor, for instance, Mexico in the Western Hemisphere, right? Mexico's not really a poor country by global standards. It's just poor compared to the United States, right? So that's well under the Mexican GDP or per capita GDP. So, not surprising then that people would leave for greener pastures.
And so it's the brain drain, right? I'm sure it's mostly the young people who want to make a decent life for themselves. And so I read a Palladium article by a guy on the ground in Ukraine. It was interesting that almost all the homeless people begging in Kiev were older people, like well past retirement age, because the young people have left and the old people are dirt poor and there's just no adequate provision for them.
All right. Well, getting back to the earlier point, is like if so let's say half the country, whatever it is, 40% to half the country wants to be either formally part of Russia or at least wants very close ties to Russia, but a separate existence. Because it's interesting that Putin, the day before this started, he recognized the independence of these two breakaway areas or republics, but he didn't annex them or take any steps to formal annexation. And I understand that some of that is because the on the ground reality is that these places are controlled by pro-Russian forces and pro-Russian governments. And so he hardly needs to take the formal step. I guess my point here is where is the end game? How do you, incorporate, or does Putin even want to incorporate millions of people who don't want to be part of his civilizational bloc, whether that means formal Russian annexation or, client state?
Presumably he wants a satrapy. I mean, I think one thing that's extremely telling is that the efforts that the Russians are making to avoid civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. And we can tell this is true because there was almost no propaganda about extensive civilian casualties. I'm sure there are some, but if there were any significant amount of civilian casualties that could be proven, they would be trumpeted all over the place.
Yeah.
And you have to assume, I mean, people argue, well, the Russian military is incompetent because it hasn't conquered the whole country in 4 days kind of stuff. I mean, that's obviously silly, but they must be, if you want to basically have the country as a satrapy, or at least maybe incorporate part of it and have the rest not be hostile to you, killing 100,000 civilians isn't the winning strategy.
Right, isn't going to do it.
That just.
But doing this at all would seem to be, problematic, as the phrase goes.
Well, but I mean, from Putin's perspective, it must be the lesser of possible evils. I mean, because clearly the regime, the Western regime, wants Ukraine to be part of NATO. And that's obviously never going to be acceptable. And they've made this clear for a long time.
Yes.
So, I mean, at some point, you're left with the worst of, the less bad of two possible alternatives. And so taking it over and basically running as a satrapy, again, is an entirely reasonable, historically speaking, geopolitical objective. I mean, I'm not sure I would do it, nor do I necessarily think that's the moral thing to do. But back in the 19th century, people didn't spend their time agonizing about the moral complexity involved in these kind of strategic wars. I mean, that's a very modern thing.
Well, let me put it another point this way, which I have unwisely said aloud to a number of people, unwisely because I turned out to have been completely wrong, but at least I wisely didn't write it down and publish anywhere. I mean, now I'm about to say it publicly.
Now you're going to say it.
Right? I thought in the run up to this crisis, okay, we know he wants those eastern parts, the Donbass, that are majority ethnic Russian and that want either to be formally part of Russia or they want to be closely allied with Russia. But he doesn't want the western part. He won't mess around in Kiev, and he doesn't want the Catholic parts or the Ukrainian nationalistic part, the places where there are not majorities of people who either want to consider themselves Russian and want to be part of Russia or are super sympathetic to Russia. So I thought, yes, unfortunately, the outcome of this may be that this country gets carved up. But if you look back to what happened in 2014 with the Crimea, which the West was very angry about and still is, and sanctioned Russia to the hilt over Crimea. But that went down fairly smoothly, right? There wasn't massive unrest. It was incorporated into Russia fairly easily. And the people of Crimea, the majority of them, as I understand it, are happy with the situation. This is one of those things that you're just, I suppose, not allowed to say, because then you're excusing, I guess, the online Twitter trolls like to call him Putler. Making fun of the left's demonization of Putin. So I thought he would stop at all of that parts. That's what he wanted. He wouldn't go after the rest. Well, okay, I was definitely wrong about that. But I'm still, it leaves me wondering what the end game here is, or what the intended strategy here is, and how, again, does he deal with these new, tens of millions of people that don't want to be part of his empire in one way or another.
Yeah, I don't know, and I didn't have as strong an opinion as you. But if you had asked me ahead of time, I probably would have endorsed that as well. So don't feel too bad. But it's I mean, I think that it's also. I mean, you kind of implied this earlier about our leaders, that they, unlike what your students think, there's not necessarily a grand plan. It's also possible there's not all that grand a plan for Putin either, right? I mean, there has to be a certain amount of reactive stuff. And since we just have no idea, for example, what Putin expected, like maybe he expected Ukraine to just roll over, the government to flee, and he could put in a puppet government and move on. And maybe he's down to plan F by this point. Who knows? I mean, I don't know. It seems to me that the most logical thing at this point is to partition the country ultimately, and the Europeanized parts of Ukraine, which used to be Poland, like Lvov, that is Lemberg, and these other, that becomes more Europeanized. But that kind of discounts the civilizational conflict element of it. I mean, if you're Putin and you're like, well, this is Russia's last chance to prosper unless it's strangled by the West, so I'm going to expand my civilizational bloc, sell as much oil as I can to the Chinese and the Indians, and watch the Europeans go down the tubes. I mean, that's a reasonable play in strategic terms, that whether you're just going to keep rolling. So if I was the Estonians, I'd be real uncomfortable about it now. Because, and yes, the Estonians are in NATO, but do you really think that NATO is going to go to war, which has a real risk of nuclear war over Estonia? I don't. I mean,
no,
I feel
I
bad
don't
for the
either.
Estonians.
I make this point.
I like Estonians, but
Yeah, I make this point all the time. That was maybe one of the dumbest foreign policy mistakes that the West has ever made. They basically gave security guarantees to countries that not only do I think they lack the will to defend, but that even if they had the will, they utterly lack the capability to defend against. It just can't. It can't be done. Okay, so let's first of all, we do know. I don't want to beat this topic to death, but people are
the topic of the day. Why not?
We might as well. We do know. I think you would agree with me that partition is impossible. Well, maybe not impossible, but the West will never go for it. Right? The West is going to say absolutely not. You can't carve up a country like that. Borders are not allowed. When the inflation
rate's 40%, they may not really care anymore.
Well, maybe not. I mean, right now, though, why did the West get so exercised about Crimea? Because it broke this supposedly sacred precedent that borders, set in 1945, you can never ever change borders using military force,
except in Kosovo.
Well, okay, fine. That was the stated argument. This can't ever happen again. So you're right. Maybe if inflation is at 40%, if things are bad enough, they might agree to some kind of partition of the country. But I think right now their stance would be across the board, from the United States to NATO to the EU to every major capital in Europe, would be absolutely not. We're not even going to consider it. We're not even going to talk about it.
Yeah.
But then let's think down the road, and it happens either as a fait accompli or because a weary West decides to agree to it. Won't the West then say, okay, well, fine, but the price for that is then the western part of Ukraine, the Ukrainian part of Ukraine, they're definitely coming into NATO now. And won't the Russians just say, well, okay, no, then no deal, no way?
Yeah, I mean, that seems logical, but I think that we're, in a sense, doing what I always say people shouldn't do, which is predict the continuation of the thing that is happening. That is, if the West is weary enough to accept the partition, the West will be on the back foot and will have to accept the non-NATO NATOization of Western Ukraine. That is, in that scenario, the West is weaker than it appears today, or than it is today, and so Putin is therefore on the ascendant. Of course, the alternative is that Putin, gets his ass handed to him in these wars, or he ends up killing 100,000 people, and therefore, I mean, if he doesn't kill a bunch of people, and doesn't destroy everything and continues this kind of precision strike and warning in advance and all these kind of things, people can kind of sweep it under the rug in a couple of years, particularly when they want cheap oil and so on. But if he kills 100,000 people, it's going to be real hard to invite him back to the parties, and just pretend it didn't happen. So many things could happen, but I'm pretty sure that a kind of straight line from now to there, variations in the status quo isn't going to be it. I think it's going to be radically one way or radically the other.
All right. Well, that brings up another interesting question. I saw, you may have seen the same report. This was 2 or 3 days ago, so a fairly early report. Claims to, and sketchily sourced, let's put it that way. That's the best way I can put it. But claims to have had information from inside, they called it his dacha or lair. Anyway, somewhere where Putin hides out when he's in, so he's not in the Kremlin. He's to continue the Putler analogy, he's in the Putin equivalent of the wolf's lair. And around the conference table, and he's screaming at all of his advisors and generals because things aren't going too well. And my first thought was, all right, I've been in the US government and I've consumed intelligence before, and I find it all but impossible to believe that we have a way to get that kind of information out of such a completely private and closed setting against a target as hard as the Russians. I find it equally hard to believe that somebody sitting around that table deliberately leaked on Putin in order to make him look bad. So this is probably just a completely made up report. Maybe not, but that was my gut reaction. That said, it points to a possibility, which is that, it's highly possible that people around Putin were willing to tolerate this risky gamble as long as A, it worked, and B, it was quick, and C, it was low cost, or some combination of the above. The longer it goes on, isn't it plausible to assume or speculate that the people around him will start to think this isn't worth it anymore? And we may see a repeat of, if you recall, the summer of '92, where Gorbachev was disappeared to the Black Sea, and the old line communists at the conference table, like 5 or 7 of them lined up in a row, said, "Oh, everything is fine. He was tired and he needed a rest."
Well, I remember.
Can you imagine something like that happening?
Well, I can in theory. What's unclear to me is how strong Putin's position is, but I do know that his approval ratings among the public are something like 85%. Now, maybe they've dropped.
Even right now.
Well, I'm not sure about now. I doubt the polling industry is. But I suspect that they have not dropped significantly. I mean, they certainly don't. When we go out and start wars, the president's approval rating goes up. I mean, even among, even though there's a vocal minority who are opposed to it, and like I think a lot of people on the right, I wasn't in favor of the Iraq war because of unintended consequences, but I certainly wasn't opposed to it. And in retrospect, the people who opposed it were correct, obviously. But my impression, and maybe it's just the impression that Putin likes to give out, is that he has a lot more strength than that. That is, Gorbachev was a totally different setup with a totally different set of factors. I get the impression that Putin's in total control. But that may just be because Putin likes to project that he has an image of total control, riding his horse bareback across the icy streams and so on. For all I know, there's people were looking to put a knife in his back. I mean, that could certainly be, I agree, a plausible scenario.
How seriously then do you take any of these, big city street protests that have taken place?
It's not clear to me how big they are. I mean, it seems like you pay more attention to them. I mean, obviously,
our media has an incentive in making them seem bigger than they are.
What was notable is that they were treated much more gently than Justin Trudeau, treated much more peaceable and less offensive to the regime, or objectively less offensive to the regime protests in Canada. And that's kind of the irony of all of this. It's not just the invasions. It's there's a very much a don't look in the mirror feel about a lot of this. That is, this behavior by our regime that, to an objective, say the Martians came down and were looking at our various geopolitical struggles, it's not clear they would draw a significant difference between the behavior of the West over the past 20 years and the current behavior of Russia, or for that matter, the current behavior of the West. It probably would see any distinctions made between those as a distinction without a difference. And I think we're going to see more of that. And you touched on this earlier when you mentioned Hillary Clinton's attempt to weaponize this against current, her current American opposition. You're going to see more and more of that, and that goes back to what I said earlier. It's just bizarre to me how fast history is returning. I'm in favor of history returning. Don't get me wrong, because I think the eternal twilight of Nietzsche's Last Man is boring, but it's not. If I were you, I would move out of DC.
Well, I'm at least I'm not in the district. I can say that in my
right. Well, you better get on that Google Maps mashup that shows the blast radius of various types of nuclear weapons. Are you familiar with that?
Oh yeah, very.
Yeah. Oh yes. Well, I always forget that you actually do have direct experience with the national security apparatus. So enough said about that.
Okay, so we don't necessarily know what's going on. We don't know where it's going to go. So I had to say my I said my obligatory critical things about Putin, all of which I believed, I hasten to add. Now I'm going to say an uncharacteristically charitable thing about the Biden administration. First of all, I need to criticize them and point out that I do think I'm not saying we wouldn't be in this mess right now if it weren't for them. But and nor am I going to use the pro-Trump talking point that's on everyone's lips right now that, oh, he would never have dared to do this had Trump been in office. Maybe not. I don't know. It is interesting, though, that Trump, as Trump likes to point, well, I shouldn't say he likes to point it out, but Trump will point out defensively when he is accused of having been soft on Russia. His go-to talking point, one of them is, no, look at all the tough things I did, the sanctions that I enacted, the diplomats I expelled, the facilities I closed down. We could put diplomats in that sentence in air quotes, by the way. And selling lethal aid, providing lethal aid to the Ukrainians. And yet he had a better relationship with Putin than Biden did, at least at this early stage, on a person-to-person basis. It's an interesting contrast or juxtaposition, and shows how in statecraft one can be tough and yet still have better relations, and that weakness often begets contempt. In any event,
and Machiavelli has something to say about that.
Yeah, he definitely has something to say.
Rule of respect. I mean, maybe you can pull a handy Machiavelli quote out. Because I think that's exactly right. That personal relations matter. It's not just all a game of written stuff and computers.
That said, I do blame to a degree the Biden administration's combination of kind of weak action, and tough talk. The exact opposite of the Teddy Roosevelt mode in getting us into this, which I think definitely contributed to it. But once into it, if the logic of the position would be, well, now the United States is committed and we got to go all in. We got to get really involved. And they're resisting that. They've rejected the possibility of a no-fly zone for the obvious, and yet one still is buoyed to hear them say it, reason that, and what does a no-fly zone really entail? It entails American planes shooting down Russian planes, and that leads to war with Russia, and that leads to God knows where, and we can't do that. Okay, well, the logic of the crazed rhetoric, though, of the past months would suggest that we ought to be in that kind of a fight. At least for now, they're saying we won't be. So good on them for that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I agree with the kind of low-level compliment to the Biden administration, though it may be like a stopped clock. It's right twice a day by accident. It may just be that they didn't put any thought into it, and they react. In this case, the reaction was the appropriate one. There does seem to be a lot of effort being put into ground supply of additional weapons to the Ukrainians from us and from the Europeans, or at least there's a lot of talk about that. What's unclear to me is how effective that is, because it's unclear to me where the Ukrainian army is currently located. That is, if the Ukrainian army is currently located in pockets mostly surrounded by the Russians, it's going to be real hard to get them fresh Javelin missiles. Yeah. So maybe that's a complete waste of time and just propaganda, or maybe that's going to extend the war. I agree with the no-fly zone thing. It's not clear to me it's entirely wiser to supply high-grade military weaponry like Javelin missiles and so on to the Ukrainians, because eventually that's an act of war as well at some level. It's not as overt as shooting down planes, but at some point you're Putin and you get tired of your main battle tanks being destroyed from above by Javelin missiles. Well, then you're going to start lobbing missiles into Poland or hitting the supply depots that are using. That's an escalation, which strikes me as unwise. I think, frankly, since it's pretty obvious Putin is going to win in Ukraine, whatever the win condition is for Putin, we should probably just get that over with, because we don't have a way of stopping that short of actually becoming directly involved in the war. And he doesn't care about being out of the SWIFT system. And if we kick him out of the banking system, he's just going to get together with the Chinese and de-dollarize much of the world's economy, which is going to bite us in the ass.
Right, that which is already happening. You do raise a good point, though. I mean, here's a thing that just to think about is to risk, not even risk, to guarantee that one will be called a traitor or something. But like, if a Russian victory is inevitable, is then supplying Ukrainian resistance on some level immoral because you're just prolonging conflict, suffering, and death that won't result in a victory?
Yeah, I think it is. But I think there's a question that comes even before then, which is there any Ukrainian resistance? That is, let's say the Ukrainian army as a whole is defeated. It's not even remotely clear to me that there is an ongoing Ukrainian resistance. I mean, historically, in Europe, I mean, the best example of this is the end of World War II. The Nazis spent a ton of time trying to say, we're going to have all these people who are going to be lurking in the bushes. And, they all went home because they were tired of it. I think that's a much more likely alternative. That is, the Ukrainian government collapses and the country's partitioned or whatever. There's not going to be an ongoing resistance. I think that, that's
the other precedent would be partisan warfare behind German lines on the Eastern Front, where there was a lot of resistance in Ukraine, but not against Russians, against Germans.
Right, but the war was ongoing. That is, they were assisting in the larger overall struggle. If the Ukrainian army goes home,
fair,
and there's no other like main battle armies, just some guys in the forest. I mean, yes, that happens in other parts of the world. I mean, obviously happened in Iraq and some other places, but I don't think the exhausted and weary and not particularly happy with their government and aging. I mean, the average age of Ukrainian is like 45 or something insanely high like that. I mean, people like that just don't run around in the woods, trying to get at the Russians. It's just not going to happen. So I do think if we supplied an ongoing resistance movement just to get people killed and in order to score propaganda points against the Russians, that would be arguably immoral, but I don't think that's going to happen. If I had to predict, I would say that the Russians are going to win, and whatever what that winning looks like for them, and then everyone's going to calm down and try to sweep this under the rug, and the West is going to be dealing with the blowbacks of their ever more precarious economic situation. But I could be wrong. Maybe Putin will decide that Finland is tasty too, and pull another Russo-Finnish war. We'll see how that goes.
All right, you mentioned the economic side. I understand that some of our sanctions have been quite painful, to the point where the ruble has crashed against the dollar. The Russian central bank had to do a 12-point rate hike on a single day. Did you see this?
I saw a reference to it, yeah.
Okay, keep in mind, when the U.S. Federal Reserve meets and just leaks that we're contemplating, we're talking about 1/4 of 1 point. Wall Street loses its mind. Every CEO calls the Treasury Secretary, the NEC director, and every economic official that they can and says, don't you dare. And the Fed backs down. Now, maybe they're about, maybe this is going to change soon, but 12 points in one day. Think about that.
Yeah.
This is going to have a negative impact on the Russian economy. And some of the things that we're contemplating or threatening, whether we actually do it or not, I don't know, would have similar bad impacts, leading one to wonder, are there things that the West could do, that it's willing to do to the Russian economy, that would be so bad for the Russian economy that the Russians would have no choice but to consider them functional acts of war and up the stakes?
Are you thinking of anything in particular?
Certain things that I've read about, but whatever those things may be. I mean,
I have two thoughts. My understanding, first of all, is that the Russians control very significant percentage of the supplies of certain crucial raw materials for the West. Fertilizer is one of them, or potash, but also nickel and some other crucial minerals are not exclusively sourced out of Russia or areas under Russian control, but largely. So, I mean, that's a two-way street. And the United States has no ability, the West in general has zero ability to absorb pain. That is, our people and our regime are so used to basically this high level of uninterrupted living. As you say, every time the Fed threatens to raise interest rates a little bit, the leaders, our corporate leaders, think that it's like the second coming of Christ or something. Like it's like that big news. And so I mean, I think that's a two-way street. But I think economics is overrated. I mean, the classic example of this, in my opinion, is I forget the exact statistic, but everyone, I think it was Norman Davies, or maybe he was Norman Angell, I can't remember. One of these early 20th century British authors wrote a whole book in like 1912 about how there could never be European war because of and the statistic is something like the dollar value or the economic value of trade among European nations in 1914 wasn't equaled again until 1956 or something, or something like that. I mean, so people are willing to shoot themselves economically in the face for larger principles. And again, that's something that I think people in the modern West have forgotten. That is, they think that there's nothing more important than making sure you can get your pizza delivered on time, and that your Grubhub will deliver your 6-pack of beer, and that anything that might disrupt that, no one would ever consider. I think this is false, and Putin's proving it to be false. And I suspect that the Russians don't really care that much.
Or it's true of some and not true of others, right? Because as I understand your reasoning here, you're saying it is basically true of people in the West. They're not willing to, but they're not. They insufficiently appreciate the extent to which others are willing to.
Yes, and I suspect that the Russians, or the majority of Russians, are willing to tighten their belts several more notches than the average American is willing to tighten his belt. And I don't think we'll hear that, because the Russians that we hear in the American media,
well, and in a sense, and I mean this as no disparagement to the Russian people, but they're more used to it, right? Russia has been deprived more. It has suffered more in the 20th century, right? And it's just fundamentally a poorer country. Then there is you talked about Nietzsche earlier, Nietzsche's last man. Well, look, there's a sense at which wealth does not equal strength, but in fact negatively correlates with strength. I saw a cheeky tweet, maybe you saw, from Dmitry Medvedev, who is, I don't know his exact title, a senior official in the Russian government and a former president of Russia, although it's unclear how much of a president he really was, because he was there because Russia had a term limits law that forced Putin out. But it appeared to most people that Putin was still kind of the gray eminent. In any event, when there's this pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a famous project that will bring natural gas from Russia to Europe. It's particularly important to the Germans, who have an energy-hungry economy and a large manufacturing sector, high-end complex manufacturing, autos, appliances, you name it. The largest economy in Europe, both aggregate, obviously, and per capita. I mean, not higher than tax havens like Monaco per capita, but higher than all of the other countries with real economies. The United States has been opposed to this for a long time. And Trump, in particular, used to rail about the Nord Stream 2. But he had a fundamentally good point, which was to say, listen, you guys tell me all the time how afraid you are of Russia, but then you're willing to build this pipeline and make yourself completely energy dependent on them, and which they could turn off at any moment. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I don't believe you're as afraid as you say you are. But I think this pipeline is a bad idea. So they're going forward with it. Well, finally, the Germans were going forward with it right up to the eve of this crisis, until the invasion happened. And then they said, after years, all right, we're done. We're canceling it. We're not moving forward on this pipeline anymore. I don't even remember the extent to which it's already been built, but it's not insignificant.
It's under ocean, so it's non-trivial exercises. I understand. It's be enormous.
Okay, and Medvedev tweeted, I don't remember the exact words, but it was something rather clever. It says, oh, you think so? So you prepared to pay? And he named numbers like X amount of euros for Y amount of cubic feet of natural gas. The point being, that's a very high price, right? Which means it will drive inflation. It will drive up the cost of everything. It will harm standards of living in Europe, and it will harm the value of exports, on which the German economy in particular depends. So if the West, getting back to the fundamental point here, is not willing to suffer the way you describe, Western peoples, aren't they about to because of this? And once that bites, it seems to me the effect that will have on Western peoples will not be to dig in and want to fight harder, but it will be political pressure on their leaders to say, please de-escalate this situation.
I think this highlights what is really probably the fundamental flaw of the West, totally leaving aside, let's say, left-right distinctions. Obviously that's important, but the fundamental characteristic of most of the leaders of the West for the past 20 or 30 years has been magical thinking. That is, we can cut off all of these other sources of energy and rely only on renewables. We can invite 1 million people a year from totally alien countries with no ill effects. We can do this, we can do that. And then when reality bites them in the ass, like the Medvedev, however you pronounce it, tweet, they don't really have a good response to that because they're so used to thinking in magical terms. They're like, that can't be true because it conflicts with my magical thinking. So I don't think when they see that, I suspect they're not actually processing it. They're like, that's a problem for future Germany. Right now, current Germany needs to take a moral stand and cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I don't think there's anybody thinking about what's going to happen ahead of next Tuesday. Just magical thinking. That's the problem here.
Yeah, I could be. Well, I don't know. I think I've said almost everything I wanted to say about Ukraine, since which was easy since I don't know much.
Well, I can assure you that a week from now, I think things will be, if not radically different, substantially different.
And clearer, would you say?
No, that I can't predict, but I mean, I would guess clearer. And I like I said, I suspect we're heading towards partition of the country and without massive more fighting. But I've been wrong before.
All right. Well, you brought up Canada. I think that's a good place to go next.
Canada.
I was quite alarmed by what I saw there. So this was my read on the situation. It answered a number of questions that I had long held, and it answered them that I thought were unknowns when it came to it, and it answered them in ways that it gave me the opposite answer from what I wanted. Okay, number one, are basically soft Western governments who are averse to using coercive powers, are they willing to give harsh orders in the midst of a crisis? The answer turned out to be yes. Okay. Second, will those orders be followed? In other words, we sometimes comfort ourselves, at least I have comforted myself, and says, all right, well, let's say there's a lawful street protest. It's totally peaceful. It's against a policy that everybody knows is outrageous. And they order the police to go in there and disperse and get rid of it and do whatever's necessary. Will the cops follow that order? The answer turns out to be yes. They follow the order. Now, it's Canada, so it wasn't exactly a bloodbath in the streets, but we did see some Australia-like violence, very, very harsh measures from Canadian police, both Ottawa Police and Royal Canadian Mounted Police, being used against protesters. Will it use extremely, presumably unpopular measures like the freezing of bank accounts and surveillance meant for terrorists and stuff like that? Will it dare use those? Yes, it did. And the fourth, will this create a major backlash that brings down the government or causes it to back down? That one is a little bit more unclear. It's because you could read what happened, Trudeau pulling the lid on the powers, as saying, well, he was afraid of where this was going. He was getting criticized. The Canadian Senate was poised to reject it, although the Parliament overwhelmingly, well, not overwhelmingly, but I think it was like 180 to 150. The House of Commons, that is, did confirm his invocation of the emergency powers. But, I would have liked to have seen a more spirited resistance to all of that stuff. And one little known issue that's out there, the Deputy Prime Minister said this, but it's being underreported, is some of those, yes, he declared the emergency over and quote unquote gave back the powers, except not all of them. They made some of them permanent, right? Little known fact, although they're on the record saying that they've made some of these powers permanent. And the precedent that it set was especially disturbing to me, because having gotten away with all of it, if such a protest were to arise again, and I think the chances of that now are lower because of what happened. I mean, why risk it the second time when they've shown themselves willing to use these powers? If it were to arise again, now the proof of concept has been delivered. It's been staged and it worked. And so now not only would Canada do it again, I'm worried about what's going to happen to this trucker convoy on the way to DC. If I am the Biden administration and I've spent a year basically saying everyone who disagrees with me is a white nationalist and an insurrectionist, and I'm going to stand up new entities within the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, the FBI, just to look at these so-called white nationalists and spy internally against insurrectionists. And now I saw Justin Trudeau do what he did and get away with it. Why wouldn't I just use all of those, just throw, whatever hesitation I might have had that, this will create too big of a backlash and I dare not. Why wouldn't I just throw all that to the wind and say, hey, Trudeau got away with it. We can get away with it down here.
You wouldn't, because you lack all knowledge of history and all foresight into the future beyond next Tuesday. I think the fundamental, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think we have a somewhat fundamental disagreement about the degree to which our current regime is fragile and to a lesser extent incompetent. That is, I maintain our current regime, meaning the American regime, but also more broadly the Western regimes, is extremely fragile and extremely incompetent and is capable of limited actions, such as in Canada, and certainly is not going to have the good prudence to not dial it up to 11 for something like that. But dialing things up to 11 for a minor protest like that is a sign of weakness and incompetence rather than strength.
Well, let me just say, this is less a disagreement than you're confident of something that I just say, I don't know. But I suspect you could be right. I mean, when I sit there and tally up lists, as I sometimes do, like the list for their being incompetent, weak, afraid, and terrified. Well, no, not exactly. If you say, regime strengths, regime weaknesses, the list of their weaknesses and reasons to believe they're weak it's not short, right?
No.
I just come out with a kind of, I look at that and I don't see a clear.
Well, we can't see the future.
I'm not clearly convinced either way.
But I will recommend a book to you, which I just read, but Stephen Kotkin, who's a Russian historian.
Wrote about this.
And so he's written a couple of books on, he's writing a trilogy on Stalin, but Uncivil Society, which is a book about the collapse of the satellite communist regimes in 1989. And so his basic point is that the myth in the West is that there was this existing set of dissidents who eventually worked together to overthrow or to put enough pressure on communist governments. And his point is there is no such amount of dissidence. That is, for example, in East Germany, which had literally 100 times per capita the amount of secret police that Hitler did, not including informants, like on the payroll secret police. In 1989, according to their official records, there were 60 hardcore dissidents, 60, in the entire country. So there was no dissidents to speak up except in Poland. But it was street protests that overthrew all these countries. He specifically talks about Romania and Poland and East Germany. But there have been street protests in the past which were brutally crushed. And then one day, the regime just couldn't hack it anymore, and minor street protests made them all run for the hills.
And were those street protests not coordinated and
not
organized?
Not in the least. And they weren't astroturfed by the West like a lot of protests are now in color revolutions and so on. And so I think that you at least potentially see something like that that here with if and the kind of missing factor in the West is that unemployment is still low. People still have Netflix. They still have food on the table. In Eastern Europe, people thought they could improve their situation dramatically by taking risks. Here, the truckers or the people in Canada or the truckers here, they want to improve the situation, but they're mostly making political complaints. After all, they all have food on the table and so on. And yes, the vaccine mandates are a threat to their livelihood and so on. But fundamentally, it's more of a political question than a question of can you feed your children? So my thesis is that when people start worrying about feeding their children, there will be much larger protests, which would be completely impossible to control and would easily result in, say, not necessarily the overthrow of the Canadian government and its wholesale replacement, but the overthrow of the elements of the Canadian government that are willing to behave in this totalitarian way. I mean, Justin Trudeau should be sent to prison for the rest of his life for his various actions during the COVID and this. I mean, and that's fine. I mean, that's what should happen, but we'll see if it does.
All right, I'm still alarmed. Like you actually have a personal connection to Australia. I don't. I did. It seemed to be one of the worst countries in the world in dealing with COVID in terms of the harshness of the measures and the willingness of the police to really behave, violently and antisocially against ordinary citizens. The beatings and the tackles and the rough, just almost brutal arrests that happened there. Now, we didn't see much of that in Canada, but we saw some of that, and it really does make me wonder, especially as as things
continue. It's a big cultural difference. Americans think that Australians are like us. They're not. They're totally sheeple. Everything I said earlier about street protests and improving your situation does not apply to Australia. Australia is basically a failed country that looks like us, but thinks completely differently. And I'm married to an Australian. I've spent a lot of time in Australia. There's like 5% of the people who have any backbone or spine left. It's like Canada, only worse. So it's not surprising at all to me that they behave in that way. Australia would gladly submit to a totalitarian state if they thought they could add 6 months to their life expectancy.
Oh, okay. Well, that's depressing.
Yeah, no,
and news to me, I wouldn't have thought that.
No, and that's because you watched Crocodile Dundee as a young man. My wife has been saying this for years, and I actually one time wrote a piece revolving about the Australians revolving around a book of lies called Dark Emu, which is about the supposed high-flung Aboriginal civilization prior to Captain Cook's arrival. But more broadly, yes, it's true that the Australians fought bravely the Anzac in World War I, and so there is some Australian history certainly of military bravery. But that was 100 years ago, and the Australians are basically a desiccated and I don't know, how do I put this without being too negative? They are a state of fearful people.
All right, so a thing that I worry about is, I mean, many things, but here's one more. We have maybe two parallel trends going on. For now, we just leave the military out of it, although to some extent these trends apply to the military, but to the police going on. One is this notion that, well, since all cops are racist, I think that's completely fake and wrong and not true, but it's been a driving factor of American policy, municipal and state policy since the summer of 2020, if not well before that, is where we're going to go in and we're going to clean out the ranks, make sure we get rid of all these people. And we're going to diversify the ranks. We're going to hire, people who are more interested in community activism, this kind of thing, rather than people who just, rather benightedly want to enforce the old unjust laws. The second thing is, when you see police officers getting arrested for what they think is doing their jobs and called murderers and tried and going to jail for the rest of their lives, or just being cashiered from the force, or even if you don't bump up against that yourself as a police officer, 2 years of constant propaganda that you're nothing but a stormtrooper, that if you actually try to enforce the law, your chief and your mayor will not back you up, it's leading people to leave. I mean, I've been reading stories about this all over the place. In almost every big city in America, the police departments are under strength. That is to say, they have the budget and they're authorized to hire or employ X number of officers. They're well below that and they can't recruit the replacements. Mm-hmm. So these two trends are making over departments with fewer people and different kinds of people. And it seems like the kinds of people who are willing to join in this environment are precisely the people who support the regime. In other words, precisely the people who, when ordered to go shut down that peaceful protest, if it's on the wrong side of the regime's current messaging, are not the ones who say, I can't do that. They're the ones who gleefully go lick their chops and go, let's go do it. Right. Mm-hmm. These people are insurrectionists. Let's go and clean this out. And I worry that we're tipping that way. And
absolutely.
So that we won't have police forces. Like, there have been some hopeful signs. There were some signs of police officers in Canada being friendly with the protesters. There was something I saw. Oh gosh, I forgot. I think this was in France. Anyway, in some country recently, there was a COVID protest, and the officers marched with the protesters, which is always exciting and buoying to see. I want to see more of that, but I'm afraid that we're going to see less and less of it, and we're going to see more and more that these departments are staffed with people who, when given an order, don't just reluctantly go along. They're into it, right? They want to go in there and clean up the insurrectionists.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But I think that this only works until it doesn't work anymore. I mean, turning the police into a left-wing regime-supporting paramilitary force has a long and maybe not distinguished, but at least existing history. The assault guards, for example, in Spain in the run-up to the Spanish Civil War were merely militarized gendarmerie for the left. And so you can take a police force that exists to protect and serve, and through the mechanisms you describe, some of them deliberate, some of them not deliberate, turn it into a left-wing paramilitary force to protect the regime. But,
you're saying that has a short shelf life.
Yes, well, it has a short shelf life because all those people who used to be in the police or used to be in the army, they go somewhere else, but their skills don't go somewhere else. And so, again, I think people have to remember that being a police officer is a job. It puts food on the table. And so right now, it's not surprising that police will participate in Canada, for example, in mostly without too much beating people up, moving people off the streets because they want to make sure that there's food on the table for their kids. But when you're the guy who used to be in the police force and now your kids don't have food, you're likely to have more training and more anger than is probably healthy for the body politic at the people who are now running the paramilitaries. I mean, this has I don't mean to sound overly pessimistic, but this story has a very definite historical arc.
All right. And another thing that worries me is, but just staying on the police point for 1 second, I just made this point in a new article that went up on American Mind yesterday that I also, this is just a suspicion on my part, can't prove it, but I fear that, let's say you're one of these guys who's still in the force and you've been watching cities burn for the past 2 years and basically been told you can't do anything about it. Or if you do arrest someone, we're going to let them go. Or, and they've been basically barred from doing their jobs. I worry that there gets to be some pent up frustration, and that when they are finally authorized by their superiors, all right, well, I know I wouldn't let you break up that other protest, but go ahead and break up this one. Some of that frustration flows out.
I can see that. I mean, young men, police forces are mostly young men, and the cutting edge of police forces is mostly young men, and young men like to fight. And, and so there's an element of that. I think there's also an element of police forces believing what the superiors tell them. I mean, I have personal friends in the Indianapolis police force, and during the BLM riots in 2020, I remember them telling me with a straight face that a lot of it was caused by out-of-town white supremacists who are attacking these people. I mean, that was a complete and total fiction. I mean, but their superiors made that up and fed it to them, and so that made them more on edge and willing to do whatever was necessary to quell the protests without having to realize or admit to the superiors having to admit to themselves that the protests were 100% BLM type riots. I think young men like to fight, and they're in what amounts to a hierarchical structure. That could be damaging. But I mean, the one thing I think we can all be sure of is that the future is going to be damaging, and our goal is to minimize the amount of damage until we can kind of buff the rough edges off our current regime and restore a more virtuous regime in America. I think we're going to face some set of troubles. It's just a question of minimizing them. And I think the problem you identify is certainly one that is going to cause trouble in a lot of localities. I don't have a solution for that, just the way it is.
I sort of ask this implicitly, but I'll just ask it directly. Do you think that they will, don't you think it's inevitable? Let me put it this way. This is a leading argumentative question. Don't you think it's inevitable that this regime down here is going to use some of the banking stuff that Trudeau just successfully rolled out in Canada to go after dissidents in America?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the only way that doesn't happen is if the economic situation is so janky that might create a bank run or something like that. But I mean, they already did, obviously. I mean, they froze accounts after 9/11, but everyone was fine with that because they through a judicial process, they froze accounts of foreign nationals who had explicit ties to terrorism. And for all I know, maybe some people got their bank accounts caught up in that unjustly, but I didn't hear about it at the time. Certainly, they're going to use that here. I mean, they've already used the tools of more informal government-mandated debanking, that is, removal of banking services from individuals upon government orders sub rosa. And that's obviously a bigger and bigger problem. The actual freezing and seizing, people don't seem to differentiate very accurately between freezing
nobody got any, as I understand it, while many bank accounts in Canada were frozen, no one had anything seized or taken away.
Yeah,
and most have subsequently been unfrozen. They basically used that as a lever to say, go home. And once you left, that's
my impression too. I mean,
that's the reporting, whether it's true or not, I don't know. I'm
pretty sure. I know people who were in the protest and close to people in the protest, and that's my understanding from them. And so I think that the issue is how far down the road of a narco tyranny do we go, in the sense that the government will definitely start freezing people's bank accounts when they're involved in protests or anti-government action. When they start seizing bank accounts or not unfreezing them in any reasonable time, which will probably happen sooner rather than later, that is likely to have extremely deleterious stability consequences, both for the banking system, but more broadly just for people's behavior. Because again, the point of these things freezing bank accounts is to make it so you can't put food on the table. Yeah. That sounds like it's a great weapon, but it's not a great weapon, because when you do it to one person and 10,000 other people start thinking about what their table looks like with no money, they become incentivized to take more direct action.
The hope is, though, that they don't become so incentivized, is that they say, getting back to good old Nick, he says that certain types of measures are useful if you only do it to a small number and then you scare everyone else. They're grateful that it didn't happen to them and afraid that it might. And so they behave.
Yes, but I think the missing piece there is that if the government started using that regularly, the situation would be much more fragile. And
right. No, I mean, that means the government has to find the exact sweet spot where they're doing just enough to make people afraid and not so much to make them desperate, so that they think, I no longer have anything to lose. And that's, another famous Machiavelli quote is, men sooner forget the death of a father than the loss of their patrimony. If they start taking your money, you're going to make people desperate pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe the American government in the 1950s could calibrate that. I'm pretty sure the government of the 2020s.
No, the government of the 2020s is staffed by psychotic wokies who hate half the population, who will relish inflicting pain and will not think through where this leads.
Yeah,
that's my sense anyway.
But I totally agree with your underlying point. But I mean, if I had, how do I put this? If I had all my money tied up in one place that could be easily accessed, I would avoid being a regime enemy. And I think that's something that you don't want to be the test case for this. So people would be wise to at least maintain alternate sources of assets and liquidity.
All right. I think, though, that they're playing it, even before we get to that point, they're already playing a dangerous game with cancellation and these kinds of things. So so far, it hasn't been used enough or against enough people, or has been used mostly against people who are just disreputable enough or easily paintable as disreputable enough that they don't occasion very much sympathy, right? But the logic of their position on this stuff is, if you hold certain opinions, you shouldn't be able to have a job, you shouldn't be able to have a bank or a credit card, and we're moving toward a cashless society, so you won't be able to transact anything. And in addition, it ought to be, think through the logic of their boycotts, right? Or we could say personal embargoes, I guess would be like, no one moral should sell you. Like, the grocer should not sell you broccoli if you are proved to be a racist or an insurrectionist. Mm-hmm. Aren't they just, it seems to me they're just trying to induce desperation in people, but they've done it on such a low level and to so few people so far. But the logic only leads to that way. I call them, outdoor concentration camp. They want to make Zeks of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but not lock them up, let them sort of roam free. And I guess in part because it allows the regime to tell itself, well, we're decent people. We're not killing anybody. We're not locking up anybody. And in fact, morality requires that we cut these people out of everything because they're bad, and only bad people want to do business with bad people.
Well, part of that I think is touched on in your recent American Mind piece, which I thought was excellent, by the way, on what was it titled? Everything is Fine. But I think more broadly, that's simply an example of more magical thinking, that you can do those things without consequences. Or without hewing. It's like sitting on a tree branch and sawing it off yourself, right? It sounds like it's a good idea because you need to saw off the tree branch, but when you're sitting on it, it's not a great idea. It's just magical thinking. So you can do that for a while, and I think certainly they've been successfully doing it for a decade, say now, at a relatively low level, as you say, to a relatively small group of people who most people regard with some amount of distaste. But eventually, the revolution being inevitable and always needed to be moved forward, a larger group of people has to be targeted for those things because the arc of history demands it and morality demands it, as you say. And that's just not going to work out for any length of time. Partially, it won't work out because people will take more direct action, but it'll also work out because people will more and more develop alternatives. It's a smaller scale version of de-dollarizing Russia. People, for every action, a reaction. And people aren't just going to sit there and say, well, I can't buy broccoli. Maybe they won't try to overthrow the government, but maybe they'll grow more of their own broccoli, right? There are plenty of actions that allow people to circumvent these things. And again, you saw these things a lot in late stage communism, where in practice, the old Soviet joke, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, is something that is society-wide, that people basically work around the government. The government has this extractive oligarchy that lives pretty high, and everyone else just basically ignores them. You can imagine a situation like that. I don't think we have the stomach or the wherewithal or the economic capacity to do that for long, but you can imagine something like that.
Well, I guess a couple things. One is I detect or have yet to detect any circumspection in them at all. And there's no sense that maybe we're going too far, nor even do I get any sense that they think, well, while all these people deserve what we're doing to them, it still may have bad consequences for us. So let's ease up a little, even though these people deserve no mercy or clemency. I detect none of that. You brought that Soviet joke to me was very apt. And one of the things I did mention in the "everything is fine" piece is the possibility that people just sort of effectively go on strike, not an official strike, but, you know, if they really start doing this to you, like there won't be an incentive to accumulate or invest money anymore if you know the state can just freeze it or seize it at any moment.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So all of a sudden there won't be bank accounts. I wish I could remember. I used to have a very good memory. Things that I read 20, 30 years ago, I remember vividly. Now I remember certain points, but I can never remember where I saw them. Some book I was reading made the following point, that in medieval societies, peasants never saved money. And some people think it's because, well, you know, they were poor. They were peasants. How could they save money? They didn't make any money. No, but they stored up wealth in other ways, in ways that it was hard for marauders or the local barons or whoever to take, right? Whereas money can easily just be taken away from you.
Sure.
Right? Your ancestral home, your hut, your house, even, you know, some small plot of land, cows, a little bit harder. And they keep their wealth in those kinds of physical forms that were harder to be taken away, right? And I wonder if I could easily see, once they really start going after dissidents through the banking system, through the financial system, just see levels of deposits drop. Not on any kind of Ayn Randian, you know, well, it's an organized, we're pulling out of this bad system, but just people just make a rational calculation. Why should I put money in the bank when they're just going to take it?
Yeah. So even people who are not opposed to the regime.
Yeah.
You know, it just seems unwise to have something that could disappear.
And I don't think they've thought this through. The extent to which productive activity will decline because people realize, you know, it's this basic classic conservative economics period, but the supposedly conservatives understand incentive structures, right?
Yeah.
If I don't get to keep a sufficient amount of what I produce and work for, I'm not going to work as hard, period.
Well, I've read that in medieval times, for the vast majority of people, the asset that was the most valuable that they had was a bed. That is, beds were actually very expensive, and you can't exactly confiscate people's beds. And so maybe part of the reason that it was the most expensive thing was because people put their money in their bed because no one was going to confiscate the bed. I think to your point about the no circumspection, I mean, it's very Robespierre-like. That is, Robespierre, you know, as the exemplar of the French revolutionaries, he just couldn't help himself. Everything had to be done more, better, harder, faster, because that's what his morality dictated. But, you know, he ended up shooting himself in the jaw and then getting executed. So that didn't work out so well for him. And one other Soviet joke, by the way, this was in Kotkin's book. I just thought this was funny. Romania, but it's kind of related to this point about how people will respond to incentives. Ceausescu, as part of his austerity, cut off the power a lot in Romania towards the end of communism. And so apparently the Romanian joke was, what's small, dark, and knocking at the door? And the answer is the future. So, I mean, hopefully that won't be us, but, you know, their lack of circumspection, you know, it could easily lead to that kind of economic collapse if people just won't participate in the system, since much of the system is basically based on more magical thinking. I mean, this is kind of my theme for the day, I guess, and I didn't necessarily intend for it to be that, but so many jobs, for example, don't actually provide any value. Giving people money for them is just a form of magical thinking. And eventually, these things are likely to get squeezed out of the system. And you could keep it going longer if they would behave with some more circumspection. But as you say, I don't think they're capable of doing that.
Well, yeah, they certainly don't seem to be capable of doing that.
Well, I mean, you know, it doesn't help when Trump had obviously many defects, and I tend to agree that it's not at all clear to me that Putin cared that much about what Trump thought relative to Biden. But it certainly doesn't help when you basically have the supposedly most important person in the country literally completely missing in action. Oh, I mean, that is not a good strategy when you have difficult times, because even if you manage to make decisions, the lines of authority must be terribly blurred. I mean, that's just not a great situation. I know this is not an original point, but it just strikes me as increasing the level of risk that we have nowadays.
Yeah, I looked at, you know, one of those poll aggregators today, and of the four most recent, I think Biden's best showing was like 40. So he's mostly in the high 30s.
Well, I do know that I'm tripling the size of my own garden this year, so at least I'll be able to eat, fresh broccoli for one season.
All right, well, good for you. The store shelves around here, I can still get food, but it has gotten appreciably more expensive, and there doesn't seem to be any plan to deal with that. And geopolitical events seem to be poised to make that particular problem worse, don't they?
Are there any luxury good? I mean, you're a chef by training, obviously. Are there any luxury goods that you couldn't live without, like fine scotch or something?
No, I mean, look, I suppose I can live without anything. I might grumble
okay,
about
fine,
it.
but what would you really miss if it disappears from the store shelves?
I mean, the things that I would really miss, I don't think are going to disappear from the store shelves. Basic food, certain cuts of meat. But you talked about workarounds. Well, people are already arranging their workarounds, food cooperatives and stuff like that. I have a friend who has a group of people that buy from some local butchers, right? Mm-hmm. So they're just completely bypassing the system. But the regime has already kind of demonstrated, it hasn't moved against these things yet, but it has demonstrated that it's aware of them and that it thinks that they might be threats and that it's going to need to do something about it later. So if you've completely zecked some group of people and then they find a way to buy broccoli from the broccoli co-op, then they're going to have to attack the broccoli co-op.
Well, that's right. My objection to Rod Dreher's Benedict option, which is that the idea you can just live without the eye of Sauron, descending on you is false. So I totally agree. That's a problem.
And I interpreted, I don't know if you saw this. This was a while ago, maybe several months ago, but it was the opening bid in the rhetorical salvo to prep the ground for these kinds of actions when the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, had an article saying farmers markets are white nationalists or are racist somehow, right? Okay, well, actually, those are among the bluest, most liberal things in the world. Have you ever, the farmer's market is like the beating heart of a blue city on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. Since I don't live in Red America, I don't really know what life is like in Red America. But, I've been to the Union Square Green Market in New York City a billion times and the farmer's market at the Embarcadero and Justin Herman Plaza in San Francisco many times. And I even lived and still live in blue suburbs, bourgeois enough that have their own little farmers markets. And these are, to borrow a term from maybe more than a decade ago, that is, describes this type of person extremely well, even though the blog long went to, stuff white people like. Mm-hmm. That's, or stuff white, and by stuff white people like, he didn't mean truckers, right? That blog meant people in the blue metros and in the bright blue suburbs and in the college towns. Well, there's nothing more stuff white people like than a farmer's market. But the New York Times and some people on the left seem to have intuited that eventually the conservatives are going to figure out that they can get their food without us being able to track, monitor, and stop it. And so we're going to have to start demonizing these things now to prep the ground for when we move against them. That was my paranoid thought on that.
Well, I think there's a certain element of truth to that. I think the actual focus on the supposed white supremacists was actually a farmer's market in Bloomington, Indiana, which is a very left-wing college town. But they found like one person who was a vendor who in his private life was arguably, I guess, a white supremacist. It seems like a very thin reed. But I agree with that. But if that's true, why haven't they gone after homeschooling?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's a good question. It's a kind of, shoe that hasn't dropped, in the sense that it seems like it's been threatened now for a long, long, long time.
Well, in the 70s, it was almost totally impossible. If anything, homeschooling goes up and up and up and up. And yes, it's true that some left-wing people also homeschool. But those two horns have kind of converged. Like it used to be a lot of anti-vax people, anti-traditional vaccines were homeschoolers, and now you have your anti-COVID vaccine people to homeschooling. But I have never been able to figure out, since homeschooling is an existential threat to the regime's ability to indoctrinate children, and yet millions of people are now doing it, and the teachers' unions are so powerful, and it's an existential threat to their ability to keep stealing money from taxpayers. Why is there not more attacks on homeschooling? I have no idea. It's very strange to me.
Do you think it will have to come?
I think it's too late. I think that the regime is incapable of ending homeschooling because I honestly think that if they tried to, by federal fiat, end homeschooling, you would either have mass civil disobedience. You basically have people just refuse to do it. I think you might get worse effects than that. It's so ingrained now in millions of people and so crucial to millions of people. And it's also true that it's not just homeschool. I mean, there's lots of these new schools, classical academies, and so on going up. I mean, and obviously the people on the right, on average, tend to have more children. So the long-term trend for this is extremely bad for the regime. That there appears to be no type of coordinated attempt to deal with it. Maybe they just don't think they have the tools. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of.
Well, okay, that does bring in why they probably are continually prioritizing immigration. As I've heard this stated before, and it is sort of true, but you have to caveat it with the immigration numbers to say, yes, long-term demographic threat because the right has more children, et cetera. They're less likely to be indoctrinated in regime institutions, et cetera, right? If the current population were stable and the future population were totally based on children born in the country, that might be true. That would be true. But that fact is, if they can continually counterbalance it with more and more an influx of immigrants, it becomes less true or untrue.
Yeah, and that's true. And so, and I don't have a good, people on the right are either unable or unwilling to address the immigration problem in any real way and have been for decades. Maybe I think in large part it's because fear of being called racist. Every time Trump mentioned that maybe it would be a good idea to examine the immigration system, it was racist. So that's a problem. But I think that what we'll see is as the economy takes a header, which seems likely, a political support for limiting immigration will go up extremely rapidly. And then what you'll inevitably get is a politician who's willing to more aggressively weaponize immigration as an actual political platform. So I think that my guess is that unrestricted immigration, as we see the Biden administration encouraging now, is not going to go on for more than a couple more years. But again, I'm the optimist.
Yeah, you are the optimist. Although we'd have to caveat that by saying, but you already sort of said this, right? I mean, you're not looking forward to a calamity. You're merely predicting one.
Yeah.
And to the extent that you're looking forward to it, you're saying that since it's inevitable, we're going to have to endure something. Let's make it as mild and as small as possible.
Right.
Is that a fair statement of your position?
Calamity.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should minimize our inevitable calamities. I guess you're right. That's kind of a mixed optimism message.
Yeah. All right. This has been another production of the Claremont Institute. I am Michael Anton of Hillsdale College. My sparring partner here was Charles Haywood of Charles Haywood. He's wholly independent from any hooks you may think you can put into him. Please donate to the Claremont Institute. It's a 501c3 organization that relies on support of listeners and readers. And thank you very much for listening.